She weighed more than what society decided a woman should weigh, and that one fact had defined every single day of her 31 years on this earth. But none of that mattered anymore. Because right now, a man with a shotgun had Eleanor Whitmore by the hair, pressing a cold barrel against her temple while the blizzard screamed outside a derailed train car somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. And every passenger in that frozen rail car had already decided she wasn't worth dying for. They were wrong. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the very end. You won't regret it. Iron Ridge, Colorado, January 1883. The cold came in through the walls of the Whitmore mansion the same way shame did, quietly, without permission, finding every crack you didn't know existed until it was already inside. Eleanor had learned that early. She was 7 years old the first time she heard a woman whisper about her at one of her father's dinner parties. She remembered the exact shade of the woman's dress, pale lavender silk, imported from somewhere with a French name Eleanor couldn't pronounce. She remembered how the woman leaned toward another woman and spoke behind her fan, and how both of them looked at Eleanor and then looked away with that particular expression that wasn't quite disgust but was close enough to leave a mark. "Such a shame," the woman had said. "The judge's daughter. Such a shame." Eleanor was 7. She hadn't yet done anything shameful. She'd simply walked into the room. That was enough. 24 years later, standing on the Denver train platform in a dress that had seen better days, stained at the hem with something she didn't want to examine too closely, the seams straining at the shoulders from nights of stress-eating cheap boarding house bread, Eleanor Whitmore understood that some lessons, once learned, never really leave you. They just get heavier. The platform was crowded for a January morning, families with luggage piled high on carts, businessmen checking pocket watches, a cluster of miners heading back to the high camps with their pay already half spent on whiskey and card games. Steam from the locomotive curled up into the gray sky and dissolved into the clouds that had been threatening snow since before dawn. Eleanor stood apart from all of it, not by choice, by habit. By 24 years of understanding, at a cellular level, that her presence in a crowd made people uncomfortable, and that the best way to manage other people's discomfort was to remove yourself from their line of sight. She had one bag, a carpet bag she'd purchased secondhand from a woman in Cherry Creek who needed the money more than she needed the bag. Inside it was everything she had left in the world: 2 changes of clothes, a small photograph of her mother taken before the woman died, a Bible with the cover falling off that she hadn't opened in 3 years, and a telegram folded so many times the creases had started to tear through the paper. She knew the telegram by heart. She'd read it 50 times in the 3 days since it arrived. Eleanor, return immediately. You will take residence in servants' quarters until debt to this family is repaid. Do not expect welcome. Father, no signature beyond that single word. Father, not Dad, not even Judge Whitmore. Just Father, like a legal document, like a title without warmth attached to it. She hadn't expected warmth. She hadn't expected anything, really, except the cold certainty that she had nowhere else to go, and this was the last door available to her, and even this door was only cracked open, not actually welcoming her through it. Victor Hale had seen to that. She'd met Victor 14 months ago at a lecture on mining investment her father had dragged her to. The kind of event designed for men with money to meet other men with money, where women were expected to stand quietly near the refreshment table and look decorative. Eleanor had never been decorative in the way that was expected of her, so she drifted to a corner near a bookcase and spent most of the evening examining the spines of books she'd already read. Victor had found her there. That should have been her first warning sign, she realized later. Men didn't find Eleanor Whitmore in corners. They didn't seek her out. They didn't cross rooms to introduce themselves to her with that particular kind of easy smile that suggested they'd already decided they liked her before they even knew her name. But Victor did all of those things, and Eleanor, 30 years old, never courted properly, never held by anyone who meant it, had stood very still in that corner and felt something happen in her chest that she didn't have a word for. He was handsome in the sharp-featured way of men who grew up knowing they were handsome. Dark hair, silver starting at the temples, well-tailored coat, hands that had never done manual labor. He spoke about silver investment with the kind of fluid authority that made everyone in earshot lean in slightly, wanting to catch every word. And he spoke to her. Not at her, not past her, to her. You look like you've read half these books, he'd said, glancing at the shelves. Which ones are worth a man's time? Depends on the man, she'd said, before she could stop herself. He'd laughed, really laughed, not the polite variety. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me all evening. She should have been more careful. She knew that now. But knowing what you should have done and actually doing it are different things. And Eleanor had been so hungry for exactly this, for someone to look at her like she was interesting, like she was worth the trouble of a real conversation, that she'd set down every defense mechanism she'd spent 3 decades building and simply let herself be seen. Victor Hale saw her all right. He saw every single thing he needed to manipulate her completely. It happened slowly, the way these things always do when someone is skilled at it. He called on her at the mansion, charming her father just enough to gain access without committing to anything. He took her on drives through the city. He wrote her letters in handwriting that slanted aggressively to the right, full of observations about her intelligence and her humor, and the particular way she tilted her head when she was thinking through a problem. Nobody had ever written Eleanor letters about her intelligence before. Her father had spent years telling her that her intelligence was wasted, given the rest of her presentation. Her mother, in the gentle, useless way of women who loved their daughters but lacked the spine to actually defend them, had murmured that Eleanor should try to be more agreeable, that men were frightened of sharp-tongued women. Victor wasn't frightened of her, or so she believed. "You're magnificent," he told her once in the carriage, and Eleanor had looked at him and thought, is this what it feels like? Is this what they've all been talking about? All those women, at all those parties, when they whispered about being in love. She thought it must be. She had no other reference point. 3 months after they met, Victor proposed. Not formally, not with her father's knowledge or permission. He said he didn't want to ask permission for something this important, that Eleanor deserved to be chosen by a man brave enough to choose her without committee approval. That framing, too, should have warned her. She understood that now. The way he positioned everything as them against the world, which is romantic when the world is actually against you, but is a manipulation tactic when what the person really means is, I need you isolated enough that you won't ask the right questions. She didn't ask the right questions. She packed a bag in the middle of the night, withdrew the inheritance her mother had left her, $1,100, accumulated carefully over years, and walked out of her father's house feeling, for the first time in her adult life, like she was walking towards something instead of just perpetually standing still. The thing about Denver in November, Victor had explained, was that the silver investment opportunity required moving quickly. The window was narrow. Other investors were circling. He'd already put his own savings in, substantial savings, he assured her, and the remaining capital needed to secure their stake was just a bit more than he'd anticipated. Eleanor gave him the $1,100 on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she couldn't find him. By the following Tuesday, she understood. She went to the address where he'd told her they'd be living together. It was a boarding house. The landlady, a stout German woman with no patience for drama, told Eleanor that a Mr. Hale had indeed rented a room, paid 2 weeks in advance, left no forwarding address, and departed 3 days ago with a woman Eleanor did not recognize from the description given. He owed me $6 for laundry, the landlady said, as if this were the most outrageous part of the situation. Men. Eleanor stood on the boarding house porch for a long time after that. She didn't cry. She wanted to. God, she wanted to. But there was a kind of damage that goes so deep it bypasses tears entirely and lands somewhere below grief, in a place that feels less like sadness and more like the confirmation of something you'd always been afraid was true. That nobody really wanted her, that she had been, as she'd always suspected, too easy to fool because she was too desperate to be loved. That she was exactly as ridiculous as everyone had always implied. She spent the next 3 weeks trying to find Victor, then trying to find any trace of the investment, then accepting the creeping horror that there had never been an investment, that she had given her entire inheritance to a man who had targeted her deliberately and specifically because she was the kind of woman who wouldn't be believed if she reported it, the kind of woman people would whisper about, the kind of woman who made police officers press their lips together and say things like, "Ma'am, were there signed documents?" in a tone that made clear they already knew the answer. There were no signed documents. There was nothing. She sent her father a letter. She didn't explain everything. She couldn't bring herself to, but she explained enough. She needed help. She needed to come home. His response had been the telegram. The train to Iron Ridge departed at 7:45 in the morning. and Eleanor boarded it with her carpet bag and her telegram, and the particular kind of internal numbness that descends when a person has been through enough that their nervous system has simply decided to take a break from processing any of it. She found a seat near the middle of the car, not too far back, not too far forward, the kind of invisible positioning she'd perfected over years. The car filled around her. A family settled 2 rows ahead, a mother, father, 3 children ranging from perhaps 5 to 11 years old. The children were already arguing about window seats before they'd even sat down. A group of businessmen took seats across the aisle and immediately began talking about cattle prices and railroad expansion and whether Senator so-and-so had the right idea about tariffs. Nobody sat beside Eleanor. They would glance at the empty seat beside her and then keep moving, finding other spots. The car was crowded, but not packed. There were other options. People found them. Eleanor kept her eyes on the window. Outside, Denver disappeared behind them as the locomotive gained speed. The platform, the station, the city falling away into open country, and then rising foothills, and the first suggestions of the mountains they'd spend the next several hours climbing through. The clouds were getting heavier. One of the businessmen across the aisle, red-faced, gray-whiskered, the kind of man who spoke at a volume calibrated for rooms twice the size of whichever one he was currently in, was telling his companion about a woman he'd seen at the station. "Big girl," he said, not lowering his voice. "You see her? Standing off by herself near the far platform, carrying that ratty bag." His companion said something Eleanor couldn't make out. "Dressed like she was headed to a funeral and already missed it," the loud man continued, chuckling. Eleanor stared at the window. She knew they were talking about her. She knew it the way you know certain things. Without evidence, but without doubt. She kept her face completely still. She'd gotten good at that, making her face into something blank and uninformative while the rest of her went on quietly falling apart. The snow started somewhere around the first major grade. Not a polite dusting, the kind of snow the Rockies produced when they were serious about it. Thick and driven sideways by a wind that seemed to have a personal grievance with everything in its path. The temperature in the car dropped noticeably. People pulled coats tighter, children complained. The family ahead of Eleanor rustled through bags for extra layers. Eleanor had no extra layer. Her coat was thin. She'd sold her better winter coat in Denver when money got tight, telling herself she'd buy another when things improved, which was the kind of optimism that stops working eventually. She tucked her hands under her arms and pressed her face closer to the window and watched the snow, and told herself she was fine. She was not fine. She was very cold, deeply ashamed, completely alone on a train full of people, headed home to be treated as a servant in her father's house, and so thoroughly exhausted by the effort of holding herself together that she felt transparent, like a person made of glass who would shatter if anyone looked at her with any real force. The rear door opened with a violence that had nothing to do with the handle. It slammed back against its frame so hard that several passengers startled. One woman actually cried out. And the blizzard outside came in with whoever came through the door. A wall of freezing air that hit the car like a physical blow and scattered papers and ruffled hair and caused the children ahead of Eleanor to shriek with theatrical delight. Eleanor turned. The man who stepped through the door was large in a way that the word large doesn't quite manage to capture. He was built the way mountains are built. Not sculpted, not designed, just the result of forces working on material over a long period of time until something formidable emerged. He was wearing a coat made from wolf pelts, which should have looked theatrical, but didn't. It looked like something he'd put together because he needed warmth and didn't have time to care what it looked like. He was maybe 40, maybe 45. Hard to tell. His face was weathered in the way of men who spent most of their lives outdoors. Not aged exactly, but marked. There was a scar along his jaw that started just below his left ear and ended at the corner of his chin. His eyes, when they swept the car in that quick automatic assessment of someone always calculating risk, were gray. Not blue-gray, just gray, the color of the sky outside right before serious weather arrived. He stood in the doorway for a moment, snow still swirling around him, and the car went quiet in the way that happens when someone enters a room who has the kind of presence that occupies more space than their body technically requires. Then he shook the snow off his coat, a single efficient motion, and started down the aisle. Eleanor watched him with the detached curiosity of someone too exhausted to manage more than that. Men like this existed in the frontier. She'd seen them before. Usually they traveled in groups of similar men, or they kept to themselves entirely, or they headed straight to the smoking car and didn't interact with the regular passenger carriages at all. This man was doing none of those things. He moved down the aisle, and Eleanor watched people instinctively give him room, the way water moves around a stone. Not because anyone made a decision to do so, but because it was simply easier than not doing it. The businessmen across the aisle who had been talking about her repositioned themselves almost imperceptibly. The family ahead went quieter. The man stopped at the row where Eleanor was sitting. He looked at the empty seat beside her. He looked at her. Eleanor felt her chin go up slightly. An automatic defense, a small assertion of dignity that her body had learned to produce in situations where dignity was under threat. The man sat down beside her. Not across the aisle in the still empty seat there. Not 2 rows ahead, where there was also space. Beside her. As if this were simply where he had decided to be, and he required no additional information to confirm it. Eleanor waited for whatever came next. The acknowledgement that he'd meant a different seat. The slight adjustment away from her that people always made, creating that invisible buffer of I am not actually with this person. The polite but pointed study of the ceiling or the floor or literally anything that wasn't her. He did none of those things. He set a worn leather saddlebag in the overhead rack, settled back into the seat, stretched his legs out. Long legs, she noticed, the kind that required negotiation even in a standard train seat, and looked out the window at the driving snow. A moment passed. Then, without looking at her, without any preamble or explanation, he reached into his coat, produced a roll of heavy fur, rabbit, she thought, or something similar, and simply laid it across Eleanor's lap. She went completely still. Wind gets worse past the first ridge, he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of someone who never raised it because he never needed to. You'll want that. Eleanor looked down at the fur. She looked at him. He was still watching the window. I'm not, she started. Not what? She didn't know how to finish the sentence. I'm not your responsibility. I'm not someone you need to worry about. I'm not the kind of person people offer things to without expecting something unpleasant in return. She couldn't say any of that. It was too honest, and being too honest with strangers on trains was not something she'd ever allowed herself. I'm fine, she said instead. He glanced at her for the first time. Just a look, brief and measuring. You're shivering. She was. She hadn't quite realized how badly until he said it. I'll be all right. Sure, he said. And then he didn't argue with her, didn't insist, didn't try to make her take the fur by pressing some kind of obligation on her. He just left it there on her lap, as if it had landed there by coincidence, as if taking it back would require more effort than simply leaving it, and went back to watching the snow. Eleanor sat very still for a moment. Then she pulled the fur up around her shoulders. It smelled like wood smoke and cold air and pine resin and something underneath all of that she couldn't name. Not unpleasant, just specific to a person who lived a life very different from the one she'd been living. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded once, the small acknowledging motion of someone who doesn't treat gratitude as a big production. The train climbed. His name, she learned in the patchwork way you learn things from strangers on long journeys, not through direct questioning, but through the natural accumulation of details, was Gideon Cross. He was headed back to Iron Ridge after a trip to Denver for ranch business. Equipment, apparently, and some dispute with a livestock agent that his tone suggested hadn't been resolved to his satisfaction. He didn't volunteer much, but he didn't shut down conversation either. He answered what she asked nothing in return, and sat in the particular way of someone comfortable with silence. Not awkward silence, not the loaded silence of two strangers with nothing to say, but the kind of silence that was simply two people occupying the same space without needing to perform anything for each other. Eleanor found it disarming. She was accustomed to conversations where she was always slightly on edge, always managing something, managing how much space she took up, managing whether she was talking too much or too little, managing the ambient concern that whoever she was talking to was about to say something about her appearance, or imply it, or make a joke that wasn't quite a joke. With Gideon Cross, she felt none of that. He simply was not interested in any of those games. You from Iron Ridge originally? He asked at one point. Not intrusively. The way someone asks because they're mildly curious and conversation is something that passes the time. Yes, she said, Judge Whitmore's daughter. She watched his face when she said it, the slight flicker that the Whitmore name usually produced in people from the territory. Recognition, slight recalibration, the social recategorization of, oh, that kind of family. But Gideon's expression didn't change in that way. He just nodded, like she'd told him something mildly interesting. You been away a while? About a year. He didn't ask what she'd been doing. She was grateful for that. Ranch country up near Iron Ridge, he said instead. Good land if you know what you're working with. Is that your land? Frost Creek? He looked at her more directly then, brief surprise. You know it? My father mentioned it. He's mentioned the owner a few times. She paused, usually in the context of wishing he'd gotten there first. Something shifted in Gideon's expression. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. That sounds like your father. You know him? Know of him. He tried to buy the east quarter of my grazing land 2 years ago. He didn't get it. No, Gideon said simply. He didn't. She looked at him. He looked back out the window. She had the sudden, irrational, exhausted sense that she liked this person. Not romantically. She had categorically removed romance from the table after Victor Hale. She was not a woman who made that particular mistake twice in the same year, but liked him in the simple way of finding someone's company better than expected. That was enough. It was more than she'd expected from this trip. The blizzard outside deepened. The bounty hunters came through the rear door just before noon, 2 of them first, with a third following seconds later. They were not trying to be subtle about what they were. The guns were visible, not drawn, but present, holstered in the particular way of men who wanted them noticed. Their coats were heavy, trail-worn. The shorter one had a face like a fist, all compressed angles and small, suspicious eyes. The taller one was young, maybe 22, with a rawness about him that meant he was either new to this work or hadn't yet learned how to file down his emotions enough to be good at it. The third was different. Middle-aged, heavy-set, with a lawman's star that Eleanor could see pinned inside his coat when it swung open, except he was carrying himself with the off-angle posture of someone who'd had that star a long time and stopped letting it mean anything particular. He had a sheet of paper in his hand. He held it up as he moved down the aisle. Looking for a woman, he announced to the car in general. Name of Eleanor Whitmore. Wanted for questioning in connection with the theft of negotiable bank drafts. $500 reward for information. The car went quiet in the particular way of people who are pretending to mind their own business while being absolutely attentive to everything happening. Eleanor went cold. Not the cold of the blizzard, deeper than that. She understood immediately, with the particular clarity that comes from having already spent weeks piecing together the complete extent of how badly she'd been used, that Victor had not merely stolen her money. He had done something else, something more calculated. He had taken negotiable bank drafts as part of whatever scheme he'd been running, and he had somehow arranged for her name to be connected to them. She was going to be blamed for what he'd done. Of course she was. She was the woman nobody would believe. The man with the compressed face was scanning the car methodically. His eyes landed on Eleanor. He said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with the assessing expression of someone confirming a description. Ma'am, he said, starting toward her, I'm going to need you to come with us. She's not going anywhere. The voice came from beside her, and Eleanor's head turned so fast she felt her neck pull. Gideon Cross had not stood up. He was still seated, still in that position of someone who found standing up too much effort for the current situation, which would have been amusing if Eleanor's heart weren't hammering with such force that she was surprised no one else could hear it. One hand rested on his thigh. The other was resting, with a casualness that was absolutely not casual, on the stock of the Winchester rifle that Eleanor now noticed was positioned against the seat beside him, pointed toward the floor, positioned such that moving it from resting to operational would take perhaps half a second. She hadn't even noticed him retrieve it. The car went from pretending not to listen quiet to completely stopped breathing quiet. The man with the compressed face, the lead hunter, she was already understanding, stopped walking. His hand moved toward his holster and then stopped, recalculating. Sir, he said carefully, this is a legal matter. Show me the paper, Gideon said. I don't need to show you. Show me the paper, Gideon said again, in exactly the same tone. Not louder, not more threatening. Simply the same, like he was willing to say it indefinitely until it happened. A moment stretched. The lead hunter's eyes went to the rifle. They went to Gideon's face. They went back to the rifle. He held up the paper. Gideon looked at it from where he was sitting. "Come closer." The hunter did not look happy about this. He walked forward 3 steps and held the paper out. Gideon read it. Eleanor watched his face. Nothing moved in it. "This says wanted for questioning, not arrested, not charged." "That's correct, and so she has no legal obligation to go with you." "She'd be wise to cooperate with—" "She's not going anywhere," Gideon said, and this time there was something in the words that was different from the 2 previous times, something that landed in the chest rather than just the ears, something that made the temperature in the railcar seem to drop another degree. "Not on this train, not in this weather, not to answer questions about a man who clearly set her up as his mark and is probably halfway to Mexico by now. You want to ask her questions, you do it through a proper court in Iron Ridge, with her lawyer present." A long pause. "She doesn't have a lawyer," the young one said, from somewhere behind the lead hunter. "She will," Gideon said. Eleanor stared at the side of his face. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the hunters with those gray eyes that were doing something she couldn't quite describe. Not hostility, exactly. More like the expression of a man who had already decided how this situation was going to resolve and was simply waiting for the other parties to catch up. The lead hunter looked at the other men. They had a conversation with their eyes. "We'll be back," the lead hunter said finally, "before the train reaches Iron Ridge." "I'll be here," Gideon said. They retreated to the rear of the car. The car breathed again, very slowly and collectively, like a single large organism. Eleanor realized she had been gripping the fur around her shoulders so hard her knuckles had gone white. She released it deliberately, finger by finger. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know." "You don't know anything about my situation." "No. For all you know, Did you steal bank drafts?" She looked at him. "No." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said, and turned back to the window. Eleanor sat with this for a moment. This astonishing simplicity. The complete absence of the elaborate skepticism she'd expected. "All right." As if it were that easy. As if the word of a woman no one had ever taken at face value was just worth taking. "That's it?" she said. "You just believe me?" He thought about it. "You've got the eyes of someone who's been cheated, not someone who cheats," he said. "Different look. And if you're wrong, then I'm wrong." He shrugged, a small movement. Wouldn't be the first time. She told him about Victor an hour later. Not all of it. She couldn't do all of it at once. Couldn't lay it all out in sequence like a legal document when some of it was still so raw that touching it wrong would start something she wouldn't be able to stop. But enough. She told him about the lecture, about the letters, about the money, about the boarding house and the landlady and the $6 for laundry and standing on that porch in November with the truth settling into her bones. Gideon listened the way some people listen, completely. No suggestions forming behind his eyes while she was still talking. No positioning for what he was going to say next. Just actual listening, which Eleanor had encountered infrequently enough in her life that it still felt strange when it happened. The snow was relentless outside. The car had gotten colder. Some passengers had given up on pretending they weren't watching and had stopped pretending. "He found me specifically," she said. She hadn't said this part out loud before. "I've thought about it a lot. He didn't meet me by accident. He knew who my father was, knew about my mother's inheritance. He went to that lecture because someone told him the judge's unmarried daughter would be there." "Sounds right," Gideon said. His voice was even, not careful. He wasn't managing her emotions. He was just telling her what he thought. "The part I keep coming back to," Eleanor said, and she was surprised by how steady her own voice was, is how easy it was for him, how available I was, how ready to believe that someone actually wanted to. She stopped. She could hear how it sounded. "I know how that sounds." "How does it sound?" "Like I was foolish." "Sounds like you were lonely," Gideon said. "That's different." She looked at the window. The mountains were huge around them now, the train cutting through a landscape that made human concerns seem appropriately small. "Same result," she said. "No, it isn't," he said, and the directness of it made her look at him. Foolish is when someone ignores the warning signs they can see because they don't want to deal with the inconvenience. Lonely is when someone acts the same way, but the warning signs were hidden because whoever put them there is skilled at hiding them. Victor Hale made money from knowing the difference, from finding women who were the second kind and making them feel like the first kind afterward. Eleanor was quiet. "That's very specific," she said finally. "I've seen his kind before." She looked at him carefully. There was something underneath the words. She didn't ask about it. It wasn't her business, and she'd learned the cost of inserting herself where she wasn't invited. But she filed it away. "My father's going to put me in the servants' quarters," she said. She hadn't meant to say this. It came out unannounced. "He said so in the telegram, that I can't be seen publicly, that I have to repay the embarrassment I've caused." Gideon's expression didn't change dramatically, but something shifted in it very slightly, a tightening around the eyes. "How do you repay an embarrassment?" "I don't know. I don't think there's a real answer. I think it's just punishment for being foolish, for making him look bad." She paused. "For being what I am, probably. I've always been an embarrassment to him. This just gave him a reason to make it official." She hadn't meant to say that last part either. She pressed her lips together. "What does that mean?" Gideon asked, not probing, just asking. Eleanor looked at him. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the woman in the lavender dress at her father's dinner party 24 years ago, and the expression on her face, and how that expression had been replicated so many times in so many different faces over the following 2.5 decades that it had eventually stopped being individual incidents and become simply the climate she lived in. "I've never been the right kind of woman," she said simply. "Not the right size, not the right shape. My father wanted a daughter who made people say, 'There goes the judge's beautiful daughter.' What he got was me. He's always let me know that." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You ain't hard to love, Eleanor." She blinked. He was looking out the window when he said it, not at her, which was almost certainly why he was able to say it, and she was able to hear it without either of them combusting from the directness of it. "I'm sorry?" she said. He turned to look at her then. Full on. Gray eyes, scarred jaw, weathered face of a man who had not spent his life around people who said comfortable things. And he said, "You ain't hard to love. You've spent your whole life around people too blind to see your worth. That's their failure, not yours." The train lurched around a curve. Eleanor looked at him and felt something happen in the region of her sternum, not the fake warmth of Victor Hale's practiced charm, not the desperate yearning of someone who had spent months believing a performance. Something different, something that felt uncomfortably real. "You don't know me," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "No," he agreed, "but I've been paying attention." Outside, the snow came down with the single-mindedness of a thing that had made up its mind. The mountains rose around the train like walls. Somewhere ahead, Iron Ridge was waiting, and Eleanor's father, and the servants' quarters, and the life she was returning to. But right now, on this train, in this seat, wrapped in borrowed fur, Eleanor Whitmore sat beside a man who had looked at her without judgment and said the truest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. She didn't know what to do with that. She tucked it away somewhere careful, somewhere she could get to it later when she needed it, and she watched the mountains and the train climbed on. They were an hour outside of Iron Ridge when the hunters came back. This time, there were 5 of them, and they didn't bother with papers. They came through both doors at once. That was the first sign that this was no longer the same situation as before. No longer 2 men with a paper trying to look official. No longer a negotiation that could be won by knowing the right legal language. The rear door opened. The front door opened. 5 men total, spreading into the car from opposite ends simultaneously. And the passengers who'd spent the last hour pretending to mind their own business suddenly had nowhere to pretend to look. Eleanor felt Gideon go still beside her. Not the stillness of someone surprised. The stillness of someone who'd already done the math. The lead hunter, the one with the compressed face and the half-legitimate star, came from the rear. He was not holding papers this time. His coat was pushed back behind the holster on his right hip. Beside him was the young one, and the young one's rawness had been replaced by something harder, which told Eleanor that someone had talked to him in the interval between confrontations and reminded him what was at stake. From the front came 2 men Eleanor hadn't seen before, broader, the kind of men hired specifically for situations where talking had already been tried. Behind them, Hanging back near the door in a way that meant he wanted to be close to the exit, was a fifth man, lean and watchful, who hadn't drawn anything yet but whose hand was resting on something under his coat. "Last time I'm asking this politely," the lead hunter said, moving down the aisle. His voice was pitched for the whole car, a performance of authority. "Eleanor Whitmore, you're coming with us." "You keep saying that," Gideon said, "and you keep making it complicated when it doesn't need to be." The hunter had stopped 6 feet away. Tactical distance, Eleanor realized. Close enough for authority, far enough to react. "Stand up, sir. Step away from the lady. This doesn't need to involve you." "It already involves me." "It really doesn't have to." "But it does," Gideon said, and there was something in how he said it, the flatness, the complete absence of performance, that made the hunter's jaw tighten. "Because you're not taking her." The car was silent, the kind of silence that had weight to it. A child near the front had started crying somewhere in the last 30 seconds, very softly, and the mother was making hushing sounds that were not successfully hiding her own fear. The businessmen who'd been talking about cattle prices were sitting very still with their hands visible on the table, having apparently assessed the situation and decided that visible hands were a good policy right now. The lead hunter glanced at the men he'd brought through the front door. A look passed between them. "There are 5 of us," the hunter said. Simply, not as a boast, as information. "I can count," Gideon said. "And one of you." "2," Gideon said, and Eleanor felt her stomach drop because he was including her in that number, and she had absolutely no idea what qualified her to be included in that number. And apparently Gideon Cross was either deeply intuitive about people he'd known for 4 hours, or he was making a significant tactical error. The hunter almost smiled. "The lady. The lady who's been sitting here for 6 hours without complaining once in weather, that's got your boys pulling their collars up," Gideon said. "Yeah, her." Eleanor kept her face still. Her heart was making a sound like distant gunfire. "Sir," the hunter said, and his hand moved toward his holster. "I'm going to count to—" Gideon lifted the Winchester from beside the seat in one motion that had so little wasted effort in it that it seemed almost lazy, except that the hammer was already back when the barrel came up, and the sound of it, that specific metallic click that is unlike any other sound in the world in what it communicates, hit the rail car like a physical thing. Everything stopped. The hunter's hand froze. The 2 men from the front stopped moving. Even the child stopped crying briefly, as if startled by the sudden change in the air. "I will shoot the first man who finishes drawing," Gideon said. He wasn't looking at any one person. He was looking at all of them, that gray gaze moving with a slow deliberateness that covered the car the way a lighthouse beam covers water. "I will do it without hesitation and without regret. If you believe I'm bluffing, test me. But I'd rather you didn't, because there are families in this car, and I'd like this to end without anyone who didn't sign up for it getting hurt." The hunter was breathing through his nose. Eleanor could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The assessment, the weighing of options, the specific arithmetic of a man who did violence for money, trying to decide whether this particular situation was worth the premium. "You know what happens to a man who shoots a legally deputized—" "Show me the deputy commission," Gideon said. "The real one. Signed by the county sheriff. Not a $5 star from a mail-order catalog." A pause. A long one. "We'll be back before Iron Ridge," the hunter said finally. The same words as before, except they landed differently this time. Not as a threat, but as a retreat with cover. He was already moving toward the rear door. The 2 men from the front followed, neither of them willing to be the one who stayed. The 5th man, the lean, watchful one near the exit, was already gone. The rear door closed. The car breathed. Gideon set the Winchester back against the seat, with the same economy of motion he'd used to raise it, and turned to look out the window like nothing of particular interest had occurred. Eleanor became aware that her hands were shaking, not visibly. She'd locked them together in her lap and the shaking was contained, but she could feel it running all the way up to her shoulders, the aftermath of adrenaline with nowhere to go. She breathed very carefully, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The technique her mother had taught her for situations of social stress, which had probably not been designed with armed bounty hunters in mind, but was apparently generalizable. "They'll come back," she said quietly. "Yes, with more men or a different plan." "Probably both." She looked at him. He was watching the snow. His face was completely composed, but she'd been sitting beside him long enough now to notice the small things. The way his right hand was resting, fingers loose but positioned, never far from the rifle. The way his eyes moved to reflective surfaces. The window glass, a silver coffee urn at the far end of the car, checking angles. He wasn't relaxed. He was resting, which was different, like an animal that has dealt with the immediate threat and is conserving energy without losing readiness. "You've done this before," she said. "Done what?" "This." She gestured, a small, imprecise movement that was meant to indicate the entirety of what had just happened. He considered this. "More times than I'd like." "What did you do? Before the ranch?" A pause. Not reluctance exactly, more like the pause of someone deciding how much context a question actually requires. "A few things," he said. "Army, for a while. Then some work I'm not particularly proud of. Then I found land I could do something with and decided to do something with it instead." She absorbed this. "The work you're not proud of?" "Bounty hunting," he said. Flat. "Not ashamed exactly, but not comfortable either. For about 3 years." Eleanor looked at the rear door where the hunters had exited. She looked back at him. "That's why you knew how to read them." "I knew what they were doing because I used to do it." He glanced at her. "Not like that. I had real commissions, real criminals, but I knew men who operated the way these ones do, chasing reward money without caring much about guilt or innocence. The line between lawman and outlaw gets thin fast when the payment structure rewards results over process. Is that why you helped me?" He was quiet for a moment, a longer one than usual. "Partly," he said. "The rest is just that what they're doing is wrong, and I happen to be here." The simplicity of it was almost strange to Eleanor. The complete absence of drama around a decision that had just put him in front of 5 armed men. She wanted to ask him more, wanted to understand how a person got to a place where it's wrong, and "I'm here" was sufficient justification for that kind of risk. But she could hear in the quality of the silence that he was done talking about himself for now. She thought about the hunters, about the thing the lid one had said, 5 of us. She thought about what Gideon had said, 2. She thought about being included in that count and what it implied about how he saw her, which was different from how she saw herself, and the dissonance between those two things was large enough to be uncomfortable. "What do you want me to do?" she said, "when they come back?" He looked at her then, a real look, not a glance, assessing. "What are you willing to do?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've never been in a situation like this." "Nobody has, the first time." He held the look for a moment. "You're not going to fall apart." "You don't know that. I watched you for 6 hours," he said. "You held yourself together through cold and humiliation and those men showing up twice. You didn't cry. You didn't appeal to other passengers for help. You didn't make yourself small. You just sat there and dealt with it." He paused. "People who fall apart, they usually start earlier." Eleanor had no answer for this. It wasn't that the words were wrong. She hadn't cried. It was true. But she knew the reason she hadn't cried was less about strength and more about the fact that she'd spent so many years crying privately that her public face had simply calcified into something that no longer showed the work. She wasn't sure that was the same thing as strength. She wasn't sure it was different either. "There's something you should know," she said, "about the bank drafts." He waited. "Victor, I think he took them from someone who hired him, as an investment agent. The drafts were legitimate bearer instruments, which means whoever held them could cash them. He needed someone to blame, someone whose name he could attach to having been in his company, who wouldn't be believed if they tried to explain." She looked at her hands. "I fit the description." "Who were the drafts from?" "I don't know exactly, but the amount was significant, more than my inheritance, much more." She looked up. "Whoever those men work for, it isn't a county sheriff. There's real money behind them." Gideon absorbed this. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind the eyes shifted. Recalculation. "How much money?" "Victor mentioned a transaction once. Offhand. I didn't understand the significance at the time. $40,000. The number sat between them. "That's not bounty hunter money," Gideon said. "No. That's hired gun money." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the window, not seeing the snow. Eleanor watched him work through it. "Victor Hale. He's running, but he's not stupid. He's got the drafts, and he's got your name attached to being his accomplice. If whoever he stole from gets you, they can try to use you to find him, or they can use you as leverage to get him to surface. Or they can just... She stopped. Make an example, he finished, without inflection. Yes. The train shuddered around a curve. Outside, the mountains had become something else entirely. No longer picturesque, just huge and indifferent, walls of granite and ice and deep pine forest that went on for miles in every direction with no sign of human presence. They were deep in the past now. Iron Ridge was still over an hour away. The storm had not eased. I'm sorry, Eleanor said, for what I've pulled you into. He looked at her. You didn't pull me into anything. I sat down. You could move to a different seat. I could, he agreed, and then said nothing else because that was apparently the end of the argument. Eleanor looked at the rear door. She thought about 5 men and $40,000 and the specific kind of person who dispatched hired guns over negotiable bank drafts in a blizzard. She thought about Iron Ridge, which was an hour away, and her father's mansion, which was at the end of that hour, and the servants' quarters that were waiting in it. She thought about what Gideon had said. You ain't hard to love. She filed it away again, a little deeper this time, and kept her eyes on the door. They came back 40 minutes later, and they came back different. No pretense of authority this time. The star was gone from the lead hunter's coat. The careful distance was gone. They moved through the rear door in a single group, crowded and fast, and the first thing the lead hunter did was grab the nearest passenger, an older man in a brown coat who'd been sleeping, by the collar and put a gun to his temple. Everybody stay seated, he said loudly to the whole car. This ends quick if everyone cooperates. The screaming started immediately. The family with the children, the mother pulling all 3 of them toward the floor, the father throwing his arms wide as if he could shield them all with his body. The businessmen were on their feet and then back down again when the second hunter swept a gun across the aisle. The young hunter had changed entirely. The rawness was gone, burned off by whatever had happened in the back of the train between now and before, replaced by the tight-jawed focus of someone who had committed. Gideon was already standing. Eleanor grabbed his arm without thinking. He looked at her hand, then her face. She didn't know what expression she was wearing. Whatever it was, it made him pause. Don't, she said. Not yet. Not with all these people in the car. Eleanor, there has to be another way. Her voice was steady. She was astonished by this. She had no right to a steady voice right now. What do they need to get off this train? What? They need her, the lead hunter said from across the car, because he'd heard. He was watching them. The gun was still at the old man's temple. They need Miss Whitmore. She comes with us quietly. Everyone else goes home to their families. Where? Gideon said. That's not your business. It is, actually. It really isn't, Mr. The hunter tilted his head. Cross. Gideon Cross. Yeah, I know who you are. De Frost Creek Ranch. Big operation. He smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. Be a shame if something happened to it while you were away being a hero on a train. Gideon's expression didn't change, but Eleanor felt something in the air around him change, something shift, like the pressure drop before a storm that's already been overhead for a while finally decides to break. That was a mistake, Eleanor said quietly, to no one in particular. She was right. She could see it happen. The moment the hunter realized that threatening the ranch was not going to produce the outcome he'd anticipated, that instead of making Gideon Cross cautious, it had removed the last thing that was making him measured. The fight happened fast. Later, Eleanor would try to reconstruct the sequence and find that she couldn't do it reliably. Not because she hadn't been watching, but because violence at that speed resists being organized into linear memory. What she retained were fragments. Gideon moving toward the gunman holding the old man, moving fast despite his size. Not in a straight line. The sound of the Winchester butt connecting with something, once, hard. The old man dropping to the floor and rolling, showing surprising presence of mind for someone who'd been asleep 30 seconds ago. The lead hunter going down, and then the young one coming forward with both hands on his gun, and Gideon redirecting the barrel upward. The shot went through the ceiling, punching a hole through which a thin stream of snow immediately began to fall. Passengers were scrambling for the floor. The mother with the children had gotten all 3 of them under the bench seat, and was herself pressed flat against the floor with her arms wrapped around them. The businessmen had, collectively and without discussion, piled into the far corner. Eleanor picked up the iron poker from the heating stove. She didn't think about it. There was no decision as such. She saw the man coming up behind Gideon with his gun drawn. Gideon's back was turned. The distance was too far for her to shout a warning that would be useful, and the poker was in her hand. The weight of it was significant, heavier than expected. She moved without elegance, without training, without any of the things that would have made the action clean or efficient. She swung it at the man's knee with everything she had. The crack of it was terrible. The sound was terrible. The man went down making a sound that was not quite human, and Eleanor stood over him with the poker still in her hand and her chest heaving and her mind very carefully not thinking about the specifics of what she'd just done because there was no time for that right now. "Behind you," Gideon said. She turned. The lead hunter, back on his feet, bleeding from somewhere on his face, had his gun up and pointed at her. He was close enough that the expression on his face was readable. Not professional anymore, not calculating, just mean. The kind of mean that comes out when someone's been embarrassed and hurt and wants to make that someone else's problem. "Fat girl nobody wanted," he said. His voice was thick. "You really think you're worth all this trouble?" Eleanor looked at him. Something inside her that had been very quiet for a very long time went completely still. And then it didn't go anywhere. It didn't crumble. Didn't collapse. Didn't do what it had been trained to do by 30 years of people looking at her the way this man was looking at her right now. It just looked back at him, and she found, to her own surprise, that she was not afraid of his opinion. She had stopped, in this specific moment, being afraid of anyone's opinion, because she was standing in the middle of a gunfight in a blizzard somewhere in the Rocky Mountains with a stove poker in her hand, and if she had not been worth something, she would not have gotten here. "Clearly," she said, "someone thinks so." The gun came up another inch. The hunter's finger moved on the trigger. Gideon threw himself in front of her. The shotgun blast, she hadn't even seen him produce a shotgun, it must have been under his coat, took Gideon Cross in the shoulder and spun him back into her. She caught him, or tried to. He was 230 pounds of solid mass, and she was not a small woman, but she was also not prepared for the weight of him. And they went down together against the seat, Gideon crashing half into her lap and half against the armrest, his right hand finding her arm and gripping it. The lead hunter stood for a moment, chest heaving, gun still smoking. Then Gideon, from the floor, bleeding from his shoulder, raised the Winchester left-handed, sighted down the barrel with one eye closed, and fired. The hunter went down and didn't get up. The remaining men, the two who'd come through the front, who had spent the last several minutes being largely irrelevant to the chaos, looked at Gideon on the floor, at Eleanor holding him, at the stove poker she still hadn't put down, at the three of their colleagues who were either unconscious or done, and they left. Through the rear door, into the blizzard, gone. The car was silent. Then the old man of the brown coat, from somewhere on the floor near the front, said, "Well," in a tone of someone who has decided that one word will have to be sufficient commentary on recent events, and sat up slowly. Eleanor was on the floor with Gideon's head and shoulders in her lap, one hand pressed hard against his shoulder where the blood was soaking through his coat, and she realized she was crying. Not the collected internal falling apart she'd become expert at, actually crying, tears running down her face, jaw shaking, the whole undignified, uncontrolled thing, and she didn't have any resources left to stop it. "Hey," Gideon said. His voice was strained, his face was gray under the weathering. "It's done." "You're bleeding very badly," she said, and her voice broke on the last word. "I've bled before." "That is not the reassurance you think it is." She pressed harder. "Don't move. Don't you dare move." He looked up at her from her lap. She looked down at him. His gray eyes were clearer than she expected given the circumstances. Pain in them, yes, but also something else. Something she didn't have a category for yet. Something she'd have to put away and examine later when her hand stopped shaking, and she wasn't using one of them to try to keep him from bleeding to death on a train. "You hit that man with the poker," he said. "Yes." "You didn't hesitate." "There wasn't time." "There's always time, if someone's going to hesitate." "You didn't." He shifted slightly and then stopped, jaw tightening against the pain. "That was good. It was the only thing I could think to do. That's usually what good looks like." he said. The train lurched forward, gaining speed on a downgrade. Outside the window, through the snow and the failing afternoon light, Eleanor could see the mountains beginning to open up, the tight pass giving way to something wider, the first suggestions of lower elevation. Her hand was soaked through. The fur he'd given her hours ago was somewhere on the floor behind them. She pressed harder and tried to remember everything she knew about stopping blood loss, which was distressingly little, and kept her hand where it was, and did not stop crying because she had decided there was nothing useful accomplished by stopping, and she needed to spend her available resources on keeping this man alive. Iron Ridge was 40 minutes away. She'd never wanted to arrive somewhere so badly in her life. The train pulled into Iron Ridge Station at 20 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, and Eleanor had spent the last 40 minutes of the journey doing 3 things simultaneously: keeping pressure on Gideon's shoulder with a strip of fabric torn from her underskirt, trying to remember if she'd ever learned anything useful about gunshot wounds, and not thinking about what was waiting for her at the end of the platform. She managed 2 out of 3. The station was small. Iron Ridge was not a city, had never aspired to be one, and its train platform reflected this with the particular modesty of frontier infrastructure: a covered wooden structure, a station master's office with a fogged window, 2 benches that had seen better decades. A handful of people waited in the cold to meet arriving passengers, their breath clouding in the late afternoon air, their coats pulled tight against a wind that had not lost any of its conviction, despite the storm being technically behind them now. Eleanor helped Gideon to his feet with assistance from the old man in the brown coat, who had introduced himself during the final stretch as Mr. Aldous Pemberton, retired schoolteacher, and who had proven considerably more useful than his sleeping posture had suggested. He'd helped tear the fabric for the bandage. He'd talked to the other passengers, keeping them calm, keeping them in their seats. He'd found a bottle of whiskey in someone's luggage and used half of it on Gideon's wound and given Gideon the other half, which Gideon had accepted without comment. "You'll need a doctor," Aldous said now, holding Gideon's left arm as they navigated the aisle toward the door. "I know a man," Gideon said. His voice was tight. Each step cost him something, though he was working hard to make sure it didn't show, which was perhaps the most Gideon Cross thing Eleanor had observed him do. "Doc Ferris," Eleanor said, mostly to herself. He'd been the only physician in Iron Ridge when she left. She hoped he was still practicing. She hoped he was sober, which had always been a variable with Doc Ferris. "Same man," Gideon confirmed. They stepped off the train into the cold, and Eleanor breathed Iron Ridge air for the first time in 14 months. It smelled like wood smoke and horse and the particular mineral sharpness of mountain cold. Not like Denver, which always carried an undertone of too many people living too close together. She'd grown up breathing this air and had told herself she didn't miss it. Standing on the platform now, she understood she'd been lying to herself about that, as she had apparently been lying to herself about several things this past year. The station master came out of his office in a hurry when he got a look at Gideon, at the blood soaking through the makeshift bandage, at the state of Eleanor's dress, at the general atmosphere of recent violence that the two of them were apparently broadcasting without meaning to. He was a young man, younger than Eleanor expected, with a blonde mustache that was still working out what shape it wanted to be. "Mr. Cross," he said, stopping short. What happened?" "Send for Doc Ferris," Gideon said. "Tell him I need him at the ranch." "Sir, you need him now. I think you need—" "I'll make it to the ranch," Gideon said, with a certainty that Eleanor found both admirable and medically questionable. "Send for him. Tell him to bring the good sutures, not the cheap ones he uses when he thinks nobody'll notice." The station master was already moving. Eleanor looked at Gideon. His face was pale under the weathering, the scar along his jaw standing out more than usual against the blood-drained skin. His right arm was hanging in a way that suggested moving it was not something he was currently entertaining. "You can't ride," she said. "I've got a wagon." "You can't drive a wagon either, not with that shoulder." He looked at her. A brief assessment. "Can you?" She thought about the last time she'd handled horses, which had been approximately never in any serious capacity, and the time before that, which was a buggy ride with a very patient mare her mother had kept, who would have trotted home on her own if Eleanor had dropped the reins entirely. "I can manage," she said. He looked at her for another moment and apparently decided this was sufficient. "Wagons at the livery on 4th. Bay team. both named something ridiculous. Bill and William, don't ask. They know the way to the ranch. I'm not taking you to the ranch, Eleanor said. Eleanor, I need to go to my father's house first. She said it the way she'd been not saying it for the last 40 minutes. Flatly, without embellishment, as if it were just a logistical fact and not something that was sitting in her chest like a stone. I have to. I have nowhere else to go tonight, and you need somewhere warm to be stabilized before you make a 2-hour wagon ride in January. He opened his mouth. The mansion has 8 bedrooms, she said, and a cook who is better at practical emergencies than my father deserves. You're going to let me take you there, and you're going to sit still and not bleed more while I deal with whatever my father has to say, and then we'll figure out the rest. A long pause. You're very bossy for someone who was shivering under borrowed fur 6 hours ago, Gideon said. I've had a difficult day, Eleanor said. Get in the wagon. The Whitmore mansion sat at the north end of town on a rise that the judge had always maintained was coincidental, but which Eleanor had understood from childhood was entirely intentional. He'd bought that particular lot specifically because it allowed him to look down, literally and physically, at the rest of Iron Ridge. It was a large house by frontier standards, built with imported materials and a studied formality that announced its owner's opinion of himself with considerable volume. Eleanor had not missed it. She drove the wagon with more competence than she'd implied to Gideon, Bill, and William being exactly as uncomplicated as advertised. The two of them plodding through the slushy streets with the mild cooperative energy of animals who had done this route enough times that they required very little input. Gideon sat beside her on the wagon bench, not talking, his jaw set against whatever the road was doing to his shoulder. You can say it, he said at one point. Say what? Whatever you're not saying about going in there. Eleanor kept her eyes on the street ahead. I'm not saying anything. You've gotten very quiet. I've had a lot to process today. You were talking on the train. I had someone to talk to on the train. She paused. You were more useful as a conversation partner when you weren't bleeding. I'm still here. She glanced at him. He was watching her with those gray eyes, still clear despite everything, and there was something in the steadiness of them that she found both comforting and difficult, in the way that anything that asks you to be seen is difficult when you're used to being overlooked. I haven't been inside that house in 14 months, she said. When I left, my father told me that if I was foolish enough to go with Victor Hale, I shouldn't expect the door to be open when I came back. He was right about the first part. She looked back at the street. He'll want to be right about the second part too. Even though he sent the telegram, even though he told me to come back, it won't feel like welcome. It'll feel like a verdict. And what's the verdict? That I'm exactly what everyone always thought. Foolish woman, bad judgment, embarrassment to the family. Gideon was quiet for a moment. That what you think? I think I gave $1,100 to a man who targeted me professionally, Eleanor said. That's not nothing. No, he agreed. It's not nothing. It's also not the whole story. My father doesn't deal in whole stories. He deals in the version that supports whatever he's already decided. The mansion came into view ahead of them, the windows lit against the early dark, smoke from 3 chimneys. The front path recently cleared of snow by someone whose job that was. Eleanor pulled the wagon to a stop at the hitching post and sat for a moment, not moving. You don't have to go in first, Gideon said. Yes, I do. She handed him the reins, awkwardly, since she was putting them in his left hand and she could see from his expression that the motion of reaching for them cost him. I'll send someone out for you. Just don't fall off the bench. I'll do my best, he said, dry as timber. She went up the front steps and knocked on her own father's door. It was Clara who opened it, the same housekeeper who'd been with the Whitmore household since Eleanor was 12, a small, stout woman from somewhere in northern Germany who had the organizational capabilities of a military quartermaster and the emotional range, in Eleanor's experience, of someone who had seen enough of the world to not be particularly surprised by any of it. Clara looked at Eleanor. Her eyes went from Eleanor's face to the state of her dress, to the wagon at the hitching post, took in Gideon's presence on the bench with the particular efficiency of someone cataloging information, and then looked back at Eleanor's face. Come in, she said. Just that. No performance. There's an injured man in the wagon, Eleanor said. I can see that. I'll send Thomas. Clara stood back from the door. Your father is in the study." Eleanor walked into the house that had been her home for the first 27 years of her life and felt nothing she expected to feel. She'd anticipated something, nostalgia or dread, or the specific weight of accumulated childhood in a place. What she felt instead was a strange flatness, like visiting a location she'd only read about rather than lived in. The foyer was exactly as she remembered: dark wood paneling, the large mirror with the gilt frame, the portrait of her father on the stairs painted by someone who had flattered the jawline. The smell of the house was the same: beeswax and tobacco, and the particular mustiness of a dwelling maintained by people but not quite lived in. She was still standing in the foyer when the study door opened. Judge Elias Whitmore was 63 years old and had the bearing of a man who had been told he was significant often enough that he'd organized his entire physical presentation around confirming it. He was tall, still trim, with white hair he wore longer than was practical, and a beard trimmed to convey authority. He was wearing his good coat, which meant someone had told him Eleanor was coming, which meant he'd had time to decide how to receive her and had chosen formality. That was information. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You look terrible," he said. "I've had a difficult journey," she said. "I imagine you have." He came into the foyer, stopping at a distance that was technically civil, but was actually the distance of a man who hadn't decided yet whether he was going to be a parent or a judge tonight. He looked at her dress, at the dried blood on her hands that she had done her inadequate best to clean on the train, at the absence of luggage beyond the carpet bag she was still carrying. "I expected worse, actually." She had no response to this. "Where's your coat?" he said. "I sold it." His mouth pressed together. "Of course you did." "I needed food more than I needed, You needed," he said, and the word had acid in it, "to have come to me before you made a series of catastrophically foolish decisions that have now attached the Whitmore name to a financial crime. Do you understand what I've been dealing with? The questions I've had to answer? He stopped. He was working himself up, and he knew she could see it, and he didn't like being seen losing control. He brought himself back. "There will be consequences, Eleanor. I outlined them in the telegram." "Yes," she said. "I read it." "The servants' quarters have been prepared. You'll take meals with the household staff. You won't appear publicly until this matter with the bank drafts is resolved, and I've had time to manage the narrative around your situation." He said the last word the way you'd say disease. "Something to be quarantined. Is that understood?" Eleanor stood in her father's foyer and looked at him and thought about the train, about the poker in her hand, about Gideon's voice saying, "You ain't hard to love," with the same simplicity he'd used to state any other fact he'd verified and found reliable, about 31 years of being too big, too loud, too inconvenient, too present in a way that nobody in this house had ever been able to accommodate. "There's an injured man at your hitching post," she said. Her father blinked. The non sequitur landed badly. "I beg your pardon?" "Gideon Cross, owner of Frost Creek Ranch. He was on the train. He was shot protecting me from the men your bank draft situation sent after us. He needs somewhere warm and a doctor, and I've already sent for Doc Ferris." A silence. She could see her father recalibrating. Gideon Cross doing the work she'd known it would do. The name landing differently than her own, carrying the weight of land and cattle and territorial significance. "Cross is here?" "At the hitching post, bleeding. So if we could continue the part where you tell me what a disappointment I am after we've gotten him inside and horizontal, I would appreciate it." Her father's expression moved through several configurations in quick succession. Outrage at her tone. The social calculation around Gideon Cross. Something that might, if she was being charitable, have been a flicker of actual concern, though she wasn't sure if it was for her or for the liability of a prominent rancher dying on his front steps. "Bring him in," he said finally, to the room in general. Then to Eleanor, lower. "This conversation is not finished." "I know," she said. "It never is." Thomas and Clara got Gideon inside with more efficiency than Eleanor had managed on the train, mostly because Clara treated wounded people the way she treated everything else, as a logistical problem requiring organized action rather than emotional response. Gideon was installed in the large downstairs guest room, the one with the fireplace, which Eleanor noted was considerably nicer than the servants' quarters her father had promised her, and which Clara had apparently decided on without consulting the judge, who looked at the choice of room and at Clara's expression and made the decision not to say anything about it. Doc Ferris arrived 40 minutes later, smelling only faintly of whiskey, which Eleanor decided to count as a professional win. He was a thin man of about 60, with hands that shook slightly at rest, but steadied completely the moment they had a purpose, which Eleanor had always found both reassuring and philosophically interesting about him. She stood in the doorway of the guest room while Ferris worked, not because she had medical business being there, but because she found she couldn't make herself leave entirely. She watched Gideon's face while Ferris probed the wound, the tight control of it, the jaw set, the breathing managed carefully and deliberately, the single moment when his eyes found hers across the room and held for a second before he looked back at the ceiling. She looked at the ceiling with him for a moment. "Shotgun spread," Ferris said, in the conversational tone of a man narrating a process rather than performing one. "You're lucky the range was enough that the pattern had opened up. Most of the shot is superficial. There's one piece sitting against the scapula that I'd rather come out." He paused. "This is going to hurt considerably." "All right," Gideon said. "Most men ask for more whiskey first." "Do what you need to do." Ferris did what he needed to do. Eleanor watched the door frame, specifically during the parts that required it. When Ferris was done, he wrapped the shoulder in clean bandaging, gave Clara a list of instructions that she received with the air of someone who would have figured most of them out independently, and told Gideon he needed to stay horizontal for at least 3 days. "I'll stay tonight," Gideon said. 3 days, Ferris repeated. "Tonight," Gideon said with the pleasant finality of someone who has heard the doctor's recommendation and is now moving on. Ferris looked at Eleanor in the doorway. She shrugged slightly. He picked up his bag. "Infection is the risk," he said to whoever was listening. "Keep it clean, keep him still, and if he develops fever, send for me immediately." He left without further editorial. The house went quiet in the particular way of a place settling after disruption. Eleanor could hear her father in the dining room, speaking to someone in the controlled voice he used when he was angry and maintaining the performance of not being angry. She heard the name Cross, and then her own name, and then a word she didn't catch. She went into the guest room. Gideon was on his back, staring at the ceiling, which she'd come to understand was his version of processing. The fire Clara had built was doing its work, and the room was warm in a way that felt almost offensive after the day they'd had. Too comfortable, too still, the luxury of it sitting wrong against the memory of the blizzard and the gunfire, and the 40 minutes on the floor of a railcar pressing her hand against his shoulder and crying. She sat in the chair beside the bed, not because she was invited to, just because it was where she sat. "How bad is it?" he asked the ceiling. "You'll live," she said. "According to Ferris, if you stay still." "I heard him." "And?" "And I heard him," he said, which was not actually an answer. She looked at her hands in her lap. They were clean now. Clara had given her water and a cloth. But she could still feel where the blood had been, the tacky resistance of it, the weight of it meaning something she hadn't fully sat with yet. "My father is going to be unpleasant," she said. "I gathered. He isn't cruel, exactly. He's just very convinced that his way of seeing things is the only accurate one, and his way of seeing me has always been as a problem to be managed." She paused. "I think he sent for me because having me unaccounted for was worse, socially, than having me contained. Not because he wanted me back." Gideon turned his head to look at her. The gray eyes were tired, but actually tired, not the focused tiredness of someone managing a situation, but the specific exhaustion that follows pain and adrenaline and a body that has spent its reserves. "What do you want?" he said. "I'm sorry?" "You. What do you want? Not what your father wants, not what happens next with the bank drafts. What do you want?" Eleanor looked at him. The question sat in the room, taking up more space than it should have from 4 words. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at the fire. "I want to not feel like a problem," she said finally. "I want to wake up somewhere and not spend the first 10 minutes of the morning calculating how much space I'm allowed to take up. I want—" She stopped. It was too much. She was too tired for this much honesty. "I don't know, something different from this." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. Not "I'll fix it," not "it'll be fine." Just all right, the same thing he'd said on the train when she'd told him she hadn't stolen anything, carrying the same weight of simple belief. Eleanor looked at this fire and said nothing else, and outside the window of her father's house the dark had come down fully on Iron Ridge, and the snow had stopped, and the sky was doing the thing it did after storms out here, clearing fast and hard, stars coming up one by one over the mountains with the cold, indifferent brightness of things that have been there a very long time and intend to remain. She sat in the chair until she heard Gideon's breathing change into sleep. Then she got up and went to find her father, and whatever came next. Her father was in the dining room with a glass of brandy he hadn't touched, which told Eleanor more than the brandy he usually drank told her. Elias Whitmore drank brandy the way other men smoked pipes. Habitually, almost absently, as punctuation to thinking rather than the thinking itself. An untouched glass meant he was too focused on something to use the habit as cover. It meant he was waiting. He looked up when she came in. She'd washed her face and changed into a dress Clara had found. One of her old ones, left behind when she'd gone, which fit differently now than it had 14 months ago, tight across the shoulders in a way it hadn't been before. She'd done her hair quickly, practically, without the performance of trying to look like she hadn't spent the day in a gunfight. She looked like what she was, a woman who had come a long way through difficult conditions and arrived with most of herself intact. She sat down across from him without being invited to. He looked at her for a moment. "How is Cross?" "Sleeping. Ferris thinks he'll keep the shoulder if he rests it properly." "And you?" The question surprised her, not because it was kind. She wasn't sure it was kind. She wasn't sure he meant it that way, but because it was there at all. "Fine," she said. "Tired." He picked up the brandy, set it down. "Tell me what happened. All of it." So she did. She had not planned to give him the full accounting, had planned, in the abstract, to give him the minimum required for the current situation and hold the rest back the way she'd learned to hold things back from him, the way you keep your hands close to your body in a room where things get knocked over. But she was tired, and she was sitting in this dining room in the dress that didn't quite fit anymore, and something about the quality of his stillness made her think, not that he deserved the full story, but that she was done managing what she gave him. That the economy of information she'd practiced her whole life was costing her more than it was protecting her. She told him about Victor, the lecture, the letters, the inheritance, the boarding house, the telegram. She told him about the train, about the hunters showing up the first time and the second, about Gideon. She told him about the fight, the stove poker, the shotgun, Gideon on the floor of the rail car. She told him about the 40 minutes holding pressure on a gunshot wound and crying in front of a car full of strangers. She left out the things Gideon had said to her. Those were not her father's. When she finished, the dining room was quiet. The clock on the mantel counted seconds. Her father's brandy was still untouched. "The bank drafts," he said. "Victor took them from someone. I was never involved. I didn't know they existed until bounty hunters showed up with a paper on a train." "I know that," he said. She looked at him. "You know? I've spent 3 weeks making inquiries." He set his hands flat on the table, a gesture she recognized, a gesture that meant he was about to say something he'd organized carefully. The drafts were taken from a Denver land syndicate. Victor Hale was their investment agent. He took significantly more than the drafts, probably close to $60,000 total when you account for everything. The drafts were the piece that could be tracked. He paused. "He put your name in correspondence with 2 of the syndicate members before he disappeared. Letters suggesting you were a partner in the enterprise. Forged. Obviously forged, but it created enough of a paper trail that the syndicate's hired men had grounds to pursue you for questioning. Not legal grounds. Any actual lawyer would have laughed them out of a courtroom, but enough to justify their employer's money." Eleanor absorbed this. The architecture of it, laid out plainly like that, was almost impressive in its thoroughness. Victor had not merely used her. He had built her into his escape plan structurally. He had created a version of events in which she was guilty enough to be worth chasing, which served 2 purposes. It gave his employer someone to focus on who wasn't him, and it made her credibility as a witness against him essentially worthless in certain circles, because she was a woman who could be pointed at and called his accomplice. "He was very thorough," she said. "Men who do this for a living usually are." Her father's voice was flat. She looked at him more carefully. There was something in his face she didn't often see there. Not softness, exactly, but the absence of the performance. The judge had stepped back from the table and left something more unfinished in its place. I've been a fool, he said. Eleanor waited. Not about Victor Hale. I didn't know about Victor Hale. He looked at the brandy. About you. About how I've spoken to you. Over the years. He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. You asked me once, when you were perhaps 15, whether I thought you were pretty. Do you remember that? She remembered. I told you that beauty wasn't the most important thing, he said. You told me it wasn't something I'd need to rely on, she said, and that I should focus on developing other qualities. Yes. He was quiet. I meant it as practical advice. I told myself I was preparing you for a realistic life. But what you heard... He stopped again. What I heard, Eleanor said carefully, was that you agreed with everyone else, that I was the kind of woman who would need a different strategy because the ordinary one wasn't available to me. He didn't disagree with her. That was, in its own way, more than she'd expected from him. She'd spent so long braced for the version of this conversation where he defended himself, where he found the framing that made him reasonable, and her reaction disproportionate. The absence of that defense sat strangely, like a piece of furniture that had been in a room so long you'd stopped seeing it, and then someone moved it, and the space felt wrong. I'm not going to pretend this fixes anything, he said. I know it doesn't, but I want you to understand that the telegram... He picked up the brandy and put it down again. I sent you to the servants' quarters because I was angry, and I was ashamed, and I was trying to... He exhaled. I don't know what I was trying to do. Punish you for something that was done to you. That's not... He didn't finish the sentence. It's not the first time, Eleanor said. Not cruelly, just accurately. No, he said. It isn't. She sat with this for a moment. The clock counted. Outside, the wind had dropped and the night was very still. I'm not staying in the servants' quarters, she said. He looked at her. I'll stay tonight, and possibly another night while Mr. Cross is being stabilized. But I'm not going to be hidden in this house like something you're ashamed of. If that's a condition of staying here, then I'll find other arrangements. Eleanor, I'm serious, Father. She met his eyes and kept them. I spent 14 months believing I'd earned the life Victor Hale was offering me because you'd spent 27 years before that telling me, in various ways, that the ordinary life wasn't available to someone like me. I was wrong to run. I was wrong to trust him. But I was primed to do both of those things by a childhood in this house, and I'm not going to come back to it and be made smaller again, not even for one season, not even to manage the narrative. She breathed. So either I'm your daughter, publicly and without conditions, or I find somewhere else to be. Both are options. I want you to choose deliberately. The silence that followed was longer than any that had come before it. She did not look away. She was aware that she was trembling slightly, not from cold, not from fear, from the specific physical response of saying something true that you've been not saying for a very long time. Her hands were steady in her lap. Her face was, she thought, composed. But inside, in the place underneath all the composure that she'd been managing alone her whole life, something was very loud. You're my daughter, her father said. He said it plainly. Not with great warmth. She was not going to get great warmth from Elias Whitmore, had never gotten it, would not start now. But plainly, the way he made legal declarations that he intended to honor. You have been, and you remain. I handled your return badly. I intend to rectify that. It was not an apology. It was not a transformation. It was a man who was not built for softness, making the most direct concession his construction allowed. Eleanor nodded. All right, she said. She didn't tell him it was enough. She didn't know yet if it was. But it was a start, and she was tired, and the person she was most interested in was in the guest room down the hall, and she needed to check on him before she slept. She stood. I'm going to bed. I'll look in on Mr. Cross first. Eleanor. Her father's voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He looked older than she remembered, in this light, without the judicial performance. Just a man in a dining room who had made decisions he was beginning to understand the cost of. He stayed on the train, he said. Cross. When the hunters came, he didn't have to. No, she agreed. He didn't. Her father nodded, slowly. That's a particular kind of man. Yes, Eleanor said. It is. She left him with his brandy. The guest room was quiet. She eased the door open and looked in. The fire had settled into coals, throwing low orange light across the room, and Gideon was awake, which she should have expected because she was beginning to understand that Gideon Cross did not sleep easily in unfamiliar places. He looked at her when she came in, said nothing. She came and sat in the chair, the same chair as before. It had already become, in a few hours, her chair in this room, which was either a sign of comfort or a habit she should be more careful about developing. "How did it go?" he asked. "Better than expected, worse than ideal." She looked at the coals. He's not a simple man to have as a father. No father is simple. Some are simpler than others. He considered this. "Mine died when I was 11, he said. Not as a trump card, not as competition for grief, just information offered in return for hers. Wasn't around much before that, ranch work. Is that where you grew up, ranch country?" "Wyoming originally, moved south when the land up there got crowded." He shifted slightly against the pillow and she watched him decide whether the pain was worth adjusting for and decide against adjusting. "Crowded being relative. How did you end up in Iron Ridge territory?" "Found land that hadn't been claimed that should have been, priced by someone who didn't understand what they had. Bought it before they figured it out." A pause. "Spent 4 years making it into something." "Alone?" "Mostly. A beat. I had a partner the first year, different ideas about how to run things." She understood from the way he said it that this was a chapter he had also filed away somewhere, not in the place you put things you want to access, but in the place you put things you've dealt with and moved past and don't require revisiting. She didn't push. "Gideon?" she said. "Yeah." "Why did you sit beside me on the train?" He was quiet for a moment. The coals shifted, settling. "You were cold," he said. "There were other cold people." "You were cold and no one was sitting with you. There were empty seats." "Eleanor." He said her name the way he said most things, without ornamentation. "You want the honest answer?" "Yes." "I noticed you on the platform in Denver, before the train. You were standing by yourself with that bag, and you were holding yourself like—" He paused, choosing. "Like someone who's learned that taking up space is a risk. Like someone who's been trained to make themselves as small as possible in a crowd, because smaller is safer." He looked at the ceiling. "I grew up around people who stood like that. It's a particular posture. It means something specific." Eleanor was very still. "And it bothered me," he said, "the way it always bothers me, so I sat down." "That's the whole reason? That's the start of it." He turned his head to look at her. The rest developed on the train. She met his eyes. The fire was low enough that the room was mostly shadow, and in the shadow his face looked less scarred, or maybe she'd simply stopped noticing the scar somewhere between Denver and here. "What developed?" she asked. "You," he said simply. "I kept listening to you talk and kept thinking, this is a person who's been living in the wrong circumstances for a long time, like a plant in the wrong soil, not damaged by itself, but by what it was put in." She looked away from him. She looked at the coals. "That's a generous interpretation of a woman who gave her entire inheritance to a con man." "The con man part is one afternoon out of your whole life," he said. "It's not the definition of you. It's the definition my father's been working with. Your father's working with a limited data set." He shifted again, more carefully this time. "Eleanor, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, not the way you answer things when you're managing how much you give away." She looked at him. "All right. When this is over, the bank draft situation, the hunters, all of it, what are you going to do?" She didn't answer immediately. The question had real weight. She'd been moving through the last 3 weeks in pure reaction, one disaster to the next, and the future beyond the immediate had become an abstraction she'd stopped letting herself think about because the present was fully consuming. "I don't know," she said. "Would you consider the ranch?" She went very still. "I'm sorry?" He looked at her with that direct gray gaze that she was beginning to understand meant he'd thought about what he was saying before he said it and was not going to be embarrassed by it. "Frost Creek is big, bigger than one man can run well. I've been managing it alone because I haven't found anyone worth bringing in as a partner." He paused. "You're organized. You handle pressure without falling apart. You hit a man's knee with a stove poker when the situation required it, and you didn't apologize for it afterward. Another pause. I'd like you to come to the ranch. Eleanor stared at him. You're asking me to work for you? I'm asking you to work with me. There's a difference. We've known each other for 1 day. 11 hours, roughly, he said, and I've seen how you handle yourself in conditions that would undo most people. He looked at the ceiling again. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking you to consider it, that's all. She sat in the chair for a long time after that, not speaking. The fire died down to almost nothing. She should get up and add wood to it, she thought. She should go to bed. She should do a number of practical things that were more immediately useful than sitting in this chair, in this room, thinking about what Gideon Cross had just said to her. She thought about it anyway. She thought about Frost Creek Ranch, which she'd never seen, which existed in her mind only as a name her father had used with barely concealed frustration over the years. She thought about too big for one man to run well, and what that actually looked like. The land, the work, the mornings that were cold and early and required something from you, the satisfaction of a thing built with your own hands in your own time. She thought about the specific freedom of a place where no one had a pre-existing opinion about you, where you arrived as yourself rather than as the judge's daughter, or the woman who'd been fooled, or any of the other narratives that had been running under her name without her permission. She thought about what it would mean to be somewhere she was included in the count. I'll think about it, she said finally. He nodded. She thought she heard something ease in his breathing, or maybe that was just the fire settling. Gideon, she said. Yeah. Sleep. The doctor was serious about the rest. I know. You're not going to, are you? Probably not much, he admitted. She got up and put 2 logs on the fire, because the room was getting cold and he was injured, and that was the practical thing to do. She stood at the fireplace for a moment, watching the new wood catch, the small, aggressive flare of it, the way the light came back into the room. The man on the train, she said, without turning around. The one who called me. She stopped. She didn't repeat it. He said nobody would risk dying for me. Gideon said nothing. He was wrong, she said. Yes, Gideon said. He was. She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a full vocabulary for yet. She was working on it, filing details, building the translation over hours and exchanges, but she wasn't there yet. What she could read in it was steadiness, specificity, the particular quality of being seen by someone who is actually looking. She picked up the blanket from the foot of the bed and laid it over him with the brisk efficiency of someone performing a practical task rather than a tender one, because she was not ready for tender, and she thought he understood that. Good night, she said. Night, Eleanor. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She didn't turn around. I'll think about the ranch, she said. She heard nothing from behind her, but she thought, she was almost certain, that in the quiet of the room, in the sound of the fire and the clock and the night settling over Iron Ridge, she heard him exhale. Just once, like a man who's been holding something for a while and has finally found somewhere to put it down. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. But it was a different kind of awake than she was used to. Not the grinding, anxious wakefulness of someone running from thoughts, but the full alert presence of someone standing at the beginning of something they can't quite see yet, trying to let their eyes adjust to the dark. 3 days after arriving in Iron Ridge, Eleanor made a decision that surprised exactly one person, herself. She'd expected to agonize over it longer. She'd expected the familiar machinery of her self-doubt to run its full cycle. The questioning, the second-guessing, the extensive internal committee hearing where every fear got equal speaking time and nothing ever got resolved. She'd been running that machinery for most of her adult life. It was well maintained. It knew all the arguments. But somewhere between the night she'd sat beside Gideon's fire, watching new wood catch, and the morning she woke up in her father's house and heard, from down the hall, Gideon arguing with Doc Ferris about whether 2 days constituted 3 days in any reasonable interpretation of the instruction, she found that the machinery had gone quiet, not broken, not gone, just quiet. The way a room goes quiet when something louder has been in it and then left, and the silence it leaves behind is different from the silence before. She knocked on the guest room door. Come in, Gideon said, in the tone of a man who had been having a frustrating morning. Doc Ferris was packing his bag with the crisp efficiency of someone who has delivered his professional opinion and is washing his hands of whatever the patient does with it. Gideon was sitting up in bed, looking considerably better than 2 days ago. Color returned, the gray gone from under the weathering, his eyes clear and irritated in equal measure. "He's healing faster than he should be able to," Ferris said, to Eleanor by way of greeting, which he is interpreting as permission to do things he shouldn't do. "I want to go home," Gideon said. "In 2 more days you can go home." "I can go home today. You can also saw off your other arm, but I'd advise against it." Ferris clicked his bag shut. "Miss Whitmore, talk some sense into him. I've clearly exhausted my capacity." He left without waiting for a response. Eleanor looked at Gideon. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who knew he was about to be told something reasonable and was already constructing his objections. "I'll drive you," she said. He stopped constructing. "What?" "To Frost Creek. Today, if you want. I'll drive the wagon." She paused. "If the offer is still open." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Not surprise exactly, but the calibration of someone who had made a calculation and was now adjusting it for new information. "It's still open," he said. "Then I'm coming." She looked at the window, at the January morning outside, thin winter sun doing its best against a sky that wasn't fully committed to it. "I'll need to speak with my father first, and pack. I don't have much to pack, which is... Actually, I suppose that's convenient." "Eleanor." She looked at him. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. And she was. That was the thing that surprised her. Not the decision, but the absence of the doubt she'd expected to accompany it. She'd spent so long operating with doubt as a constant background condition that its absence felt conspicuous, like a sound you've been living with that suddenly stops, and the quiet is so pronounced you keep looking for where it went. "All right," he said. She went to find her father. He was in the study, which was where he was most mornings, the judge's domain, lined with law books and the careful accumulation of 40 years of professional life. He looked up when she came in, and she could see that he'd already understood something was happening from the particular way she was standing in the doorway. She told him directly. She was going to Frost Creek Ranch. She didn't know for how long. She would write. She expected him to handle the matter of the bank drafts through the proper legal channels. She gave him everything she knew about Victor Hale's operations, the names he'd mentioned, the locations, the timeline, and she expected him to do it as her father and not as a judge managing a liability. He listened. He didn't interrupt, which cost him something. "You trust this man," he said when she finished. "Yes." "You've known him 3 days." "I've known some people 30 years and trusted them less." She held his gaze. "He sat down beside me on a train when no one else would, and then he bled on the floor of a rail car keeping me alive. That's the kind of evidence I find persuasive." Her father was quiet. He looked at his desk, at the papers on it, at the particular organized chaos of a man who controlled most things in his professional life and had not managed the same in his personal one. "I'll handle the legal matter," he said. "I know a man in Denver with contacts in the syndicate. Victor Hale will be found eventually. Men who steal that much always surface when they try to spend it." He paused. "Your name will be cleared. I'll see to it personally." "Thank you." "Eleanor." He stood. He came around the desk, which was unusual. Her father conducted most difficult conversations from behind it. The physical barrier, a professional habit so ingrained she'd stopped noticing it until he abandoned it now. He stopped in front of her, and he was taller than she was, which had always made their confrontation slightly asymmetrical, but he looked in this moment less certain than his height suggested he should. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the telegram, for the servants' quarters, for a longer list than that, if I'm being accurate, which I'm told I should be." She looked at him. This man who had spent her entire childhood making her understand that she was the wrong version of a daughter. This man who had loved her, she believed, had always believed, in the complicated way you believe things about parents that coexist with knowing they hurt you, but had loved her in a form that was too conditional, too contingent on her being something other than herself. He wasn't transformed. She could see that clearly. He was a 63-year-old man making a late and imperfect attempt at something he should have done 20 years earlier, and the attempt was real, but it didn't retroactively repair what it came after. She knew that. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise, to him or to herself. But she also knew, standing in this study, in the dress that didn't quite fit, on her way out the door to a life she was choosing rather than one she'd been assigned, that she was done carrying the weight of his failures as if they were her own. That was the thing that had been quietly shifting during the 3 days in this house, the thing she hadn't had language for until right now. She was putting it down. Not forgiving it away, not pretending it wasn't real, just declining to carry it any further. "Thank you for sending the telegram," she said. Even the way it was written, it meant I had somewhere to come back to. He nodded. His jaw was tight. She could see him working to hold some expression steady that wanted to do something else, and she found she felt something complicated on his behalf. Not quite pity, not quite tenderness, something in the neighborhood of both that didn't have a clean name. She hugged him. It surprised them both. She wasn't sure who was more startled, him when her arms went around him, or herself for deciding to do it. He was stiff for a moment, unused to the physical language of it, and then he put one hand on her back, briefly, the awkward, sincere gesture of a man who hadn't been good at this and knew it. "Right when you get there," he said. "I will." She left the study and went to pack her one bag, which took very little time. The road to Frost Creek Ranch was 2 hours north and west of Iron Ridge, climbing into the higher ranch country where the land opened up from the tight mountain passes into long valleys with views that went for miles in every direction. Eleanor had never been this far north of town. She'd grown up hearing about this territory, her father's frustrated descriptions of it, the way he'd talk about the land up here with the proprietary longing of a man who had wanted something and not gotten it. But she'd never seen it herself. She was not prepared for it. She'd expected ranch country to look functional, practical. She'd expected open land and working infrastructure, fences and corrals, and the necessary unglamorous machinery of a cattle operation. All of that was there. But underneath it, and around it, and in every direction the eye could reach, was something else entirely. A scale of landscape that the eastern part of the territory simply did not have. A bigness that was not aggressive but was utterly indifferent. Mountains at the far edges of the valley sitting so still and so large that looking at them did something to a person's sense of their own proportion that was not unpleasant. She understood suddenly why Gideon Cross had spent 4 years making something here rather than going somewhere easier. He rode beside the wagon on a horse Clara had sourced from somewhere, over Eleanor's objection and Doc Ferris's written disapproval, delivered via note that Gideon had read and pocketed without comment. He wasn't a fast ride, was clearly managing the shoulder with every motion, but he hadn't been prepared to arrive at his own ranch in the back of a wagon like a man being delivered, and Eleanor had recognized early in the argument that this was a position he'd die on, and had stopped arguing. "There," he said, at a point where the road came over a low rise. She saw it. Frost Creek Ranch was not beautiful in the way that paintings of ranches were beautiful. It wasn't romantic, wasn't designed for aesthetics. It was built for use, every structure placed with the logic of function. The main house set back from the creek for flood reasons, the barn positioned to catch morning light for the horses, the bunkhouses in a line against the prevailing wind. But it was solid in a way that meant something specific on the frontier, the solid of a thing built by someone who intended to be there for a long time and built accordingly. No temporary materials, no corners cut, everything square and set and meant to last. The ranch hands came out when the wagon pulled in. There were 6 of them. She'd learned their names over the following days. And they looked at Gideon, and then at Eleanor, and then at the bandaging visible above Gideon's collar, and then at each other with the rapid, silent communication of people who work closely together and have developed a language of looks. "Mr. Cross," said the one who stepped forward, a broad-shouldered man of about 30, with a face that had done a lot of weather. "We heard there was trouble." "There was trouble," Gideon said, getting down from the horse with careful deliberateness. "It's handled. This is Eleanor Whitmore. She'll be staying." A pause. The ranch hand looked at Eleanor on the wagon. She looked back at him. His expression was not hostile, but it was evaluating, in the way of someone who had worked for one person for a long time and was now recalculating the terms. "Ma'am," he said. "This is Hector," Gideon said to Eleanor. "He's been running the day-to-day since I've been gone, and he'll have done it better than I would have. Hector, she's going to be learning the operation. Show her whatever she asks about." Hector looked at Gideon, looked at Eleanor. Some decision passed behind his eyes. "Yes, sir." he said, and the evaluation didn't disappear exactly, but it shifted, filed under wait and see rather than problem. Eleanor understood wait and see. She could work with wait and see. The weeks that followed were not easy, and she would not have believed them if someone had described them to her beforehand. She had never worked physically in her life. The work of the ranch was constant in a way that was almost biblical. Not in the sense of punishment, but in the sense of something fundamental, something that preceded civilization's decision to put some people in drawing rooms and others in fields and pretend that was the natural order. She was sore for the first 2 weeks in muscles she hadn't known she had. She made mistakes, wrong gates left open, wrong feed for the wrong animals, wrong assumptions about how horses worked when you were behind them rather than beside them. She fell in the mud on the 4th day completely, flat out fell in the mud in front of 3 ranch hands who had the grace to mostly look at the sky until she got up. Hector handed her a rag without comment. She wiped her face and went back to what she'd been doing. That, she realized later, was the moment something changed with the ranch hands. Not the fall, the getting up. The not apologizing, not explaining, not performing the elaborate embarrassment that women in her former life would have performed. Just standing up and continuing. She didn't fully understand that she'd passed a test until Hector started actually teaching her things rather than just answering her questions. Gideon recovered. He pushed the pace of his recovery in the way she'd anticipated, doing more than he should too early, and she fought with him about it twice. Actual arguments, not managed discussions, the kind where both parties said things they meant and neither capitulated gracefully. She won the first one. He won the second. The third ended in a draw where both of them were standing in the barn at dusk, slightly out of breath, until Gideon said, You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. And she said, You're the most stubborn person I've ever met, which covers considerably more ground. And then they stood there in the specific silence of an argument that has run out of fuel and is cooling, and it was almost companionable. She learned the rhythm of the ranch. Early mornings, the cold was something she'd had to make peace with, not something she ever stopped noticing. And the particular satisfaction of work that had visible results. There was something in it that the life she'd been living before had not had. A directness. You did a thing. You could see the thing you'd done. The value of it was immediate and legible. The approval or disapproval of the work was in the work itself, not in the faces of people watching you do it. She started sleeping better than she had in years. The bank draft matter resolved itself in March, 6 weeks after her arrival at Frost Creek. Her father's letter arrived on a Wednesday, delivered by the Iron Ridge postwriter, and she read it in the main house kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. Victor Hale had been found in New Mexico territory, not by her father's contact, in the end, by the consequences of his own habits. He'd used one of the stolen drafts to buy property under a thin alias, and the syndicate's lawyers had been watching for exactly that move for months. He was arrested on a Tuesday afternoon in a town called Mesilla, apparently in the middle of a meal, which Eleanor found she had no particular feelings about one way or another. He would stand trial in Denver. The charges against Eleanor were formally withdrawn. Her father had submitted a deposition on her behalf, and the syndicate's own investigation had confirmed she had no involvement or knowledge of the scheme. It was over. She sat with this for a moment. She'd expected to feel something significant, relief or vindication, or some release of the thing that had been sitting in her chest since the boarding house in Denver. What she felt was quieter than that. Not anticlimactic, exactly. Just appropriately sized. The resolution of a problem she'd been carrying, resolved. She could put it down. She put it down. She went and found Gideon. He was at the fence line on the east quarter, checking posts after the last freeze, which was exactly the kind of task he did himself when he could have sent Hector or one of the others, because he was the kind of man who needed to put his hands on things to trust that they were solid. She'd learned this about him over 6 weeks, in the same incremental way she'd learned everything about how he was built, not through direct disclosure, but through accumulation, detail by detail, the portrait of a person assembled over time. She told him about the letter. He listened. He nodded. He turned back to the fence post he'd been checking. Good, he said. That's all you have to say. What else is there? She considered this. Most people would say more. Most people feel the need to fill space, he said. It's over. You're clear. That's what matters. She stood beside him at the fence line and looked out across the east quarter, which was the land her father had tried to buy and hadn't gotten, and she thought about how strange it was that she'd ended up here, on the other side of that failed transaction, standing inside the boundary of it rather than looking at it from the outside. "I want to stay," she said, "permanently, not just learning the operation, as a genuine partner. Equal stake in the decisions, equal share in what the ranch produces." He stopped checking the post. "I can't offer money," she said. "I don't have any. I can offer work, which you've seen, and judgment, which you can evaluate for yourself, and—" She paused. "I'm done undercutting myself in the middle of a negotiation because I'm afraid of how I sound. I'm worth what I'm asking. You know that." He turned to look at her. The afternoon light was flat and cold and honest, the way winter light out here never dressed anything up, and in it he looked exactly like himself. Scarred jaw, gray eyes, a man who had chosen this land and this life deliberately and built it with his actual hands. "I was going to ask you," he said. "I was waiting until you were sure." "I'm sure. Equal stake," he said. "Equal decisions." He looked at her steadily. "That means when you think I'm wrong, you say so. You've experienced that already. Twice. You'll experience it more." Something moved in his face. That thing she'd been building the vocabulary for over 6 weeks. She had more of the language now, could read more of the text. What was in his face right now was genuine, unperformed, the expression of a man looking at something he values and not bothering to obscure the fact. "There's something else I want to say," he said. "All right." He looked at the fence post for a moment, then back at her. He was not a man who struggled to say things. She'd noticed that, the directness of him, the way he didn't circle. But he was choosing his words carefully now, which meant they mattered to him. "I didn't sit down beside you on that train to rescue you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. You didn't need rescuing. You needed someone to be there, someone to sit down. And the rest of it was you, the poker. The pressure on the wound for 40 minutes without me asking you to. The conversation with your father. The decision to come here. None of that was me." He held her gaze. "I'm not interested in a woman who needs saving. I'm interested in you. There's a difference." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 7-year-old girl at the dinner party, standing very still while a woman in lavender silk decided she was a shame. She thought about 31 years of learning to be smaller, to take up less space, to preemptively apologize for her own presence. She thought about Victor Hale's letters and how she'd read them in the lamplight of her father's house, feeling, for the first time, like someone had looked at her and chosen her. The thing was, and she understood this now, in a way she hadn't understood it then, Victor hadn't chosen her. He'd chosen what she represented, her loneliness, her hunger for exactly this, her willingness to believe because she'd been waiting so long to be believed in. He'd chosen the vulnerability of a woman no one had ever sat beside on a train. What Gideon was doing was different. Gideon saw her. Not the inheritance, not the judge's daughter, not the woman who'd been fooled. Her. The person who got up out of the mud and kept going. The person who argued and meant it. The person who had held her hand against a wound for 40 minutes in a blizzard and cried without apology because some situations required crying, and she'd been too tired to manage otherwise. He was choosing that person. Specifically and deliberately, with full knowledge of the parts that weren't easy. "I'm not easy," she said. "No," he agreed. "I have opinions about almost everything, and I don't keep them to myself. I've noticed. I'm not going to become quieter or smaller because it's more convenient. I wouldn't want you to." She looked at him and said, "Okay." And somehow those 2 syllables contained everything she'd been not saying for 6 weeks. The accumulation of mornings in the kitchen and arguments in the barn and evenings at the table going over the ranch ledgers with their heads close together and the specific quality of being known by someone who was actually paying attention. He crossed the distance between them and he kissed her, and it was not a perfect kiss. She moved at the wrong moment, and their noses bumped and he pulled back slightly and they both stood there for a second, and then she laughed, actually laughed, the unguarded kind she'd been stingy with her whole life. And he laughed too, which was the first time she'd heard him laugh fully, and it was a good sound, a real sound, the sound of someone who doesn't do it on demand but means it when it happens. They stood at the fence line in the January cold, and the laughter settled, and then he kissed her again, more successfully, and the east quarter of Frost Creek Ranch stretched out behind them under the wide, flat sky. The spring came late that year. the way spring did in the high country, reluctant, intermittent, showing up for 3 days and then retreating again for a week before finally committing. But it came. The creek ran full with snowmelt, and the grass came up in the low meadows, and the calving season kept everyone on the ranch at reduced sleep for 3 weeks, which Eleanor worked through with the particular focused competence she'd been building since January. Hector stopped watching her from the corner of his eye somewhere around the second week of calving, when she spent 14 hours straight dealing with a difficult birth alongside him, and didn't complain and didn't defer, and at the end of it sat down in the barn with her back against the wall and fell asleep for 20 minutes, and then got up and started the next thing. After that, he simply treated her as part of the operation, the same way he treated everything else that had proven itself, directly, without ceremony. She wrote to her father. The letters were not warm in the way of letters between people who had worked everything out because they hadn't worked everything out, and she'd decided she wasn't interested in the performance of resolution that hadn't actually been achieved. But they were honest, which was more than their communication had ever been before, and over the months her father's letters back to her became, incrementally, less formal, less judicial. Still not warm. He was not going to become a different man at 63. But carrying the occasional small admission, the occasional question that was not rhetorical, the occasional sentence that sounded less like a judge and more like a father who was trying to figure out how to be one late in the game. It wasn't enough, but it was more than it had been, and more was not nothing. By summer, people in Iron Ridge had started talking about Eleanor Whitmore again. It was inevitable. She came into town with Gideon for supplies. She attended the occasional meeting at the land office on ranch business. She existed in ways that were visible, and visible women in small towns generate commentary whether they want to or not. What they said was different from what they'd said before. She heard fragments of it, the way you hear things in places where sound carries, the feed store, the post office, the edge of conversations in the general store. They talked about the train, which had become something of a local story, the blizzard, the bounty hunters, the details embellished in the way of frontier tales, until the version circulating bore only partial resemblance to what had actually happened. They talked about Frost Creek and its new partner arrangement. They talked about the calving season productivity, which was the highest the ranch had recorded. Some of them still talked about her body. Some of them still had opinions about what she looked like, and whether that was appropriate, and what it meant about her character or her choices, or the judgment of the man she was with. She heard that too, because you don't stop hearing it entirely, because the world doesn't change that fast. And some people's opinions of a woman are formed before she walks into the room and aren't available for revision. But here was the thing she'd learned, in the months since a blizzard, and a train, and a man who sat down beside her without explanation. Other people's opinions of her body had never actually been about her. They'd been about the people holding them, about their need to rank and categorize, to place other people below themselves as a management strategy for their own fears. She had spent 31 years believing their opinion was information about her. It wasn't. It had never been. She was not smaller than they thought. She was not larger than she should be. She was exactly herself. The specific dimensions and shape and weight of a woman who had survived a winter that tried to take everything from her and had come out the other side with mud on her boots and her name clear, and a life she'd built with her own hands in a valley where the mountains sat so still and so large that a person's sense of proportion was constantly being recalibrated. One evening in late August, she and Gideon sat on the porch of the main house after dinner, watching the light go out of the sky. The mountains to the west held the last of the sunset the way they always did. Reluctantly, in stages, the color draining from the peaks slow enough that you had time to watch it happen. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm thinking." "About?" She considered. "The train," she said. "January." How different everything looked from that seat. He was quiet, looking at the mountains. "I keep thinking about the version of me that stayed," she said. "Who went back to the servants' quarters? Who let my father define the terms?" She watched the last light leave the highest peak. She would have been fine, probably. She would have managed. She was good at managing. But, managing isn't the same thing as living, she said. "I didn't know that before. I thought they were the same. I thought surviving intact was the goal." She looked at her hands, which were work-roughened now in a way they'd never been, the hands of someone who used them. The goal is actually to be somewhere, to be present in your own life, not just administrating it from a safe distance. Gideon turned his head to look at her. Is that what you're doing now? Being present? She thought about the calving season and the mud and the arguments and the mornings that were cold and early and required everything from her. She thought about the laughter at the fence line, the unguarded kind. She thought about the specific satisfaction of work that left visible results, and the evenings with the ledgers, and the way the valley looked after rain. Yes, she said. I think so. He reached over and took her hand. Not a gesture, not a statement. Just the simple thing of two people sitting beside each other at the end of a day and choosing to be in contact. His hand was rough and large and warm, and she held it, and the mountains went dark against the sky, and the first stars came up over the eastern ridge the way they always did out here, hard and bright and without any interest in what was happening below them, just present, steady, having been there long before any of this and intending to remain long after. Some stories end with transformation. The person became something different, was remade, emerged unrecognizable from what they entered. Eleanor Whitmore's story was not that story. She was still herself. Still stubborn, still taking up the space she took up. Still the specific dimensions of a woman the world had spent 30 years trying to convince she was too much. What changed was simpler and harder than transformation. What changed was that she stopped believing them. That was all. That was everything.